Morning, ladies and gentlemen. As the representative of the World Energy Council London, I would like to thank the Slovenian member committee and here specifically Dr. Slatic for organizing this conference, which happens, I think, at a very important point in time where we really need to think how the future energy system could look like. Secondly, what I would like to do is I would like to give you an insight into the latest thinking as far as scenarios are concerned. And at the World Energy Council in London, we use scenarios in order to form a picture of how the future might look like. And we all agree, and I think Professor Glanchon has said that, if you look at the Earth from the moon, the picture we get might be a bit opaque. Or as some people said earlier to me, it could be foggy. Others might say, well, it's gray. And as we all know, gray comes in many different shades. So what I want to do is I would like to take you through the latest scenario thinking. But first of all, let me spend a minute or two on what the World Energy Council actually is and what we do. I would say that the World Energy Council is the truly global and inclusive and impartial network of energy professionals who work in a national or international environment. The World Energy Council is made up of almost 95 national committees today, and it comprises members from ministries, big energy companies, and energy practitioners. We work with over 3,000 members, and our flagship event is really the World Energy Congress. The next World Energy Congress will take place actually in mid-October in Daegu in South Korea, and I'm pleased to say that some of the findings that I will be presenting here today are really unique because we will launch our scenarios publication at the World Energy Congress. So I feel very privileged and honored to be here to talk a little bit about energy scenarios. The question really is, why do we need to think about how the energy landscape might look like? And I think the indicators we are getting is that demand is not evening out. Although we see a recession happening, we forecast that by 2050, actually energy demand and specifically electricity demand will increase significantly. We are also aware as an international body that access to electricity is far from becoming a reality. And I'm very pleased to hear that the issue of energy equity has been mentioned earlier on, and I would like to come back to that in my presentation. A lot has been said about energy efficiency. So at the World Energy Council, we feel that it's important to think about energy efficiency and the role energy efficiency can play in dampening demand. We also see that although there is a multiplicity of institutions in the energy field around, better cooperation is possibly needed in order to address some of the emerging issues that we're facing. And last but not least, as mentioned previously, funding is always an issue. So what is the way forward? I think the way forward really is that we need to focus our thinking on where the solutions could potentially come from. And we could say that maybe demand-side management is important. We could look into national policies and also international governance issues. Last but not least, I think the cooperation with academic institutions and research and development and also dissemination of new technologies is important. To channel our thinking, the World Energy Council has adopted scenario building as a technique for many decades. In fact, I think the first scenarios were done at the end of the 1980s. And I think scenarios are a great tool to think about those uncertainties because they are plausible and alternative stories of the future. They don't try to forecast things really. Instead, what we want to do is we want to portray a range of potential options and outcomes, and we want to enable politicians, practitioners in the energy field, and also customers with a view of what needs to be done today in order to meet growing energy demand, for instance, by 2050. And we call this the uncertainty funnel. As uncertainty increases over time, the range of events and possible options also widens. And I think it is really up to us to see what needs to be done today in order to meet certain targets. So once we've established the scenarios, we can then use them for policy making. Scenarios are more than just stories. And when we started, we did a wide range of workshops to collect ideas and insights and those indicators that might help us to form a picture of how the energy landscape looks in 2050. And there's a multiplicity of scenarios around. I would say that ours are a little bit special because they build on the unique expertise that the World Energy Council, through its member committees, has. So they are truly bottom-up. They are very inclusive. We try to address all parts of the energy value chain, and also we focus on what we call the energy trilemma. And this is also what Dr. Jordan referred to in her presentation. The aim of achieving environmental sustainability, energy security, and energy equity. Of course, we had to give our scenarios a name. And I'm quite glad that, Damien, in your presentation, you talked a little bit about the role of governments and markets, who picks the winners. And this is what we try to describe when we chose the names jazz and symphony. So our scenarios are called World Energy Scenarios, Composing Energy Futures to 2050. Basically, the question really is, what could a world that looks like jazz offer and a world that looks like symphony? So the idea here is that jazz is a kind of music that is based on individuals playing their instruments in a very independent way. Symphony, on the contrary, is a little bit more orchestrated. Many times you will have a conductor who tries to coordinate each instrument to play in tune. Of course, we use these as pictures to talk about the energy future. And basically what we try to describe is that in jazz, we have price-conscious consumers, and basically markets pick technology winners. So this is exactly what was mentioned earlier on. We might see high levels of GDP growth and maybe increased export activity. The main players in the energy field in a jazz setting will be multinational companies, bank, and venture capitalists. A key distinguishing factor between the two scenarios, by the way, is our view on carbon markets. In the jazz scenario, where we have liberty and freedom amongst market participants, we would say that carbon markets grow relatively slowly from bottom up, based on regional, national, and local initiatives. This is different in the symphony scenario, where carbon markets are designed top-down based on an international agreement with commitments and allocations from governments. You will also see that in symphony, voters are more environmentally oriented, and ultimately governments pick technology winners through incentive schemes and subsidies. There might be slightly less GDP growth and a reduced amount of export and imports due to rather nationalistic strategies. The main players in a symphony setting could be private and public sector companies, local governments, and non-governmental organizations. The question obviously is, if we look at the stories, where does that take us? And I'm pleased to say that we have quantified the scenario stories by making assumptions about population growth, economic development, energy demand, energy efficiency, energy intensity, and we've used a so-called linear optimization technique called a Markov model, which is also used by the International Energy Agency, by the way, to quantify our stories. And the question is, what are the themes that arise? What are the key results if we look ahead up to 2050? What we see in our scenarios is that the share of fossil fuels in total primary energy will remain the same or slightly decrease. So in 2050, about 77% will be of energy demand will come from fossil fuels. In symphony, this is 59% compared to 80% today. Global final energy demand is increasing. In the jazz scenario, this is going to double almost. In symphony, we have slightly less economic activity and therefore slightly lower global final energy demand, but it is still a significant increase compared to 2010 data. Per capita electricity consumption will roughly double. In jazz, we assume that this will be 5,440 kilowatt hours per year. In symphony, this could be around 4,600 kilowatt hours per year, in comparison to an average consumption globally of 2,580 kilowatt hours per year. Sorry, it should be kilowatt hours per year, obviously. CO2 emissions. In our scenarios, we also look at overall levels of CO2 emissions, and what we can see is that CO2 emissions in the jazz scenario will roughly double from the previous period from 1900 to 2004 up to 2050. In symphony, the cumulative CO2 emissions are slightly lower. We expect a total of 1,400 gigatons a year. These are just a few headlines. What I would like to do is I would like to briefly go into some more details and explain to you where the differences come from. So if we look at global total primary energy supply, in jazz you can see that this is much higher than in symphony. And this is due to the assumption that we've made with regard to global economic activity and economic growth. We also assume that jazz, the upstream sector, is much more liberalized. We have technology development taking place. And what you can also clearly see here is that coal remains dominant in some regions of the world. The analysis we've done is basically looking at two things. First of all, we have global scenarios, but we are also able to break things down by region, and in fact some of the results that I will show to you will be regional findings later on. In symphony, we have tighter supply, higher infrastructure costs, and also energy security issues which reduce fossil use potentially and therefore a higher share of nuclear in the energy mix. If we look at electricity production by primary energy type, we can clearly see the dominance of fossil fuels. In the jazz scenario, coal is expected to remain dominant globally. This is basically due to its cost, and the share of natural gas increases, especially in North America. Nuclear, the biggest growth here is mainly in non-OECD countries. In the symphony scenario, simply because governments are more environmentally oriented, the share of coal drops, and we see here a clear emergence of CCS technology. The share of nuclear is increasing, and this is mainly based on government initiatives. And you can also see that the share of renewables is increasing, and this is again due to government subsidies and interventions. Renewable electricity production is one of the key aspects that we looked at in our scenarios. And if I may draw your attention to the findings in symphony, we would say that renewables undergo a very rapid development, accounting for almost 50% of total electricity generation in 2050. And you can see here that the technology that we see will emerge really as the key driver behind all this would be solar PV. And this is basically due to the fact that it can be applied quite universally in a decentralized manner. In comparison to hydro, I think the potential is much bigger. Hydro also has a very high share, but is limited as far as its availability is concerned. In the jazz scenario, this is less so the case, simply because there is a lower share of renewables in the electricity generation mix. CO2 emissions. Earlier on, we talked a little bit about CO2 by region, and you can see here that in line with the energy used in each of the scenarios, CO2 emissions vary significantly across regions. Basically, emissions will be highest in East Asia and also in Central Asia, less so in Europe, and you can see the distinction between the symphony and the jazz scenario again. This basically tells us that in symphony, governments are better in terms of reducing CO2 emissions due to increasing use of CCS technologies and also an increasing share of renewables in the electricity generation mix. One of the key uncertainties, and I think it's important to bear in mind that when you do scenarios you have to deal with uncertainties, is the use of carbon capture, utilization and storage techniques. This is one of the key uncertainties in our scenario model. There are others, but I would say this is one of the uncertainties that we discussed in the most controversial manner in our steering group. Basically, we assume that CCS has a role to play in mitigation emission. However, we also say that without government intervention, CCUS is basically not taking off. In the symphony scenario, the share of CCUS will be much higher than it is in the jazz scenario, and this is simply because the market will not deliver CCUS if they don't have to. In symphony, we would also see that CCUS is predominantly used in enhanced oil recovery, and it is increasingly required on new build for coal generation power plants. Where does that take us? I'm glad, Damien, that you mentioned the current discussion that is going on with regard to the IPCC. We've used the IPCC emission levels in order to benchmark the scenarios that we have developed. So what we feel very comfortable with is we can talk about emission. We can talk about particles per million, and we can then benchmark our emission levels with previous results from the IPCC. And what you see here, the black lines indicate emission levels for symphony, that would be the lower one, and jazz. The question obviously arises, where does that take us in terms of climate change? And as you quite rightly said, Damien, the science is there, but still there are some critics out there who would doubt the direct relationship between CO2 emissions and climate change. So we try to be careful at this point. But I think it is fair to say that in a jazz type of setting, where we have high economic growth and a lot of demand for energy, we will be somewhere between 4 and 6 degrees of global warming. This could be lower in the symphony scenario, where there's higher emphasis on protecting the environment and the use of renewables. In symphony, the climate change could be somewhere between 2 and 4 degrees. So what we see is that a 2-degree climate change target would be towards the lower end. And if you think that the reality is somewhere between those two extreme cases, I think it's more plausible that we're looking at a 4-degree kind of climate change as a reality here. As I mentioned, we at the World Energy Council think that the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions is possible, especially in the second half of the scenario period, which is after 2030, so between 2030 and 2050, once also governments, especially in India and China, become increasingly aware of the climate implications. CCS could be a suitable technology that can be used, but there are some key uncertainties with regard to the use of this technology and also with regard to solar energy and also energy storage. And I would say that energy storage is probably the second biggest critical uncertainty that we've looked at. So if you were to ask me, what would you do? I would say energy storage. I mean, if we are able to address this issue and if we can promote research in this area by working together with academic institutions, I think that could be a very fundamental driver that helps us to change the energy landscape up to 2050. And last but not least, at the World Energy Council, we will also always make a statement for markets. And I think it's really up to markets to deliver. Obviously, the market design has to be right to reduce those uncertainties, create a stable framework for investment, and also to make sure that there are benefits to consumers. By the way, we have also addressed the investment needs, and I think what we can say is that in order to meet future energy demand, huge investments are needed in electricity generation infrastructure. And those needs will be highest in East Asia, probably also North America, and then Europe. And this is basically, first of all, to manage the transition of the energy system and also to meet future and growing demand of energy. Let me maybe summarize the findings quite quickly. I think what we see is, and this is, I think, where also the work that the WEC has done can provide an important impulse to the discussion here, is that coal remains a dominant fuel globally. There's some potential for coal to liquids, and there are increasing challenges around CCS as a technology. We also see that natural gas will gain more importance in the energy share. If you look at it globally, I think this is quite important to bear in mind. We've seen the shale gas revolution in the US. Now the picture here in Europe might be different due to the competition between coal and gas, probably for electricity generation, changes in the pricing mechanism, but last but not least, I think we need to think about security of supply in the gas sector as well. As far as oil is concerned, our scenarios show quite clearly that this will continue to be a dominant fuel in transport. Despite the advances that we're trying to make with electric mobility, for instance, or the use of CNG and LPG for transport. Nuclear, again, globally, is not a game changer that will help us to address the climate change issue. I think nuclear for some time has been perceived as a good tool to reduce CO2 emissions. However, if you look at it globally, I think we don't see that this is the trend, especially in a post-Fukushima setting. Hydro has a great economic potential, especially in sub-Saharan Africa and Latin America. Here, I think questions arise with regards to market design, and I think we would need more regional market integration in order to fully benefit from the large hydro potential that exists in those parts of the world. So the discussion actually that we have with regard to market integration is not a European one, it also happens in other parts of the world. We fear that the share of renewables could increase, and last but not least, I think one of the key issues also is energy efficiency, and I think sometimes it is a little bit underestimated. Energy efficiency has to do with technology on the one hand side, but it also has to do with people, with changing awareness with regard to energy consumption and energy use, and I think this is where more work needs to be done in order to convince consumers to use energy more efficiently. I will skip the last page, and I would like to thank you for inviting me to present the most recent findings of the scenarios work. This was just a very brief insight into what scenarios can offer, and I would like to draw your attention to the forthcoming World Energy Congress, where we're going to present the full set of results. So thanks a lot for having me.